Welcome back to the show. I have been extremely tough on our next guest. I'll admit it, I've been rude to him. So I must salute James Moore, the Minister for Canadian Heritage, for coming on the show. James Moore, thanks for joining us from our Ottawa studio.
Well, I was told you're not going to wear your Mark Delahunty uniform, and but you are going to be wearing a shirt, so this is good. It's a good compromise.
It's a good progress, and no lipstick today. Listen, you're a very good sport because I've been quite rough on you, and I'm glad that we're going to talk substance. I've got a few questions I'd like to ask you about your portfolio. One of them came from the non-partisan Information Commissioner, Suzanne Legault, just about a week ago at Parliament. I'd like to play a very brief clip about her criticisms of the CBC and access to information. Let's roll that clip, and then, Minister, I'll ask you to comment.
I said that I'm concerned with their guidelines, which I just became aware of in preparation for this committee meeting, and which seems to indicate that they would make a decision on the application of the exclusion on new section 68.1 on the face of the wording of the request itself. And if that's the case, and they do this without retrieving the records and without processing all the records and without applying appropriate severances under the legislation, then I'm seriously concerned.
Let me translate from legalese to English. The non-partisan Information Commissioner is worried that the CBC isn't complying with the spirit of the access information laws. Minister, as the boss of the CBC in Parliament, what do you say to that?
I agree with her, and I agree with her concerns, and I think that her comments, coupled with the comments that were made before the same committee by Conrad von Finkenstein, chair of the CRTC, I think taken together, I think paint a picture of concern that we have. Look, when we brought in the Federal Accountability Act and we said to the CBC that you have to abide by the Access to Information Act, that's what we expected, and I think finding loopholes or finding ways to have even the perception of trying to skirt accountability for the taxpayers' money that they get is not appropriate. And I understand that the president of the CBC, Hubert Lacroix, will be at committee next week to address these issues, but we've made it very clear to him publicly and privately that we expect the CBC to be accountable to taxpayers for the money that they're spending. And if they don't, they do themselves harm. They do themselves harm, and I think it's important that they understand that.
But, Minister, if they persist in avoiding access to information, appealing the Information Commissioner's rulings in courts, will you bring forth legislation to close these loopholes, as von Finkenstein might have suggested, or is this? I mean, I don't think it's enough to say, well, it's to their discredit. I think you've got to rein them in. Would you contemplate toughening up their access to information laws if they continue to skirt them?
Yes, if we have to, we will. I mean, I'll give you an example, Ezra. Like, it's one thing to say, it's one thing for the CBC to say, well, we won't disclose who I had lunch with, but we will disclose how much money I spent on lunch. That's fine. But to say, I won't disclose how much money I spent on lunch because I had lunch with somebody whose identity might be commercially sensitive, that misses the point. Taxpayers should know where the money is being spent, and using excuses to avoid accountability is not the intent or spirit of the law, and they need to understand that, and if they don't, then we'll take appropriate action.
I'm very pleased to hear you say that. Now, the other day, Christine Stewart, the Executive Vice President of the CBC, was engaging in a Twitter debate with critics, and she said something a little bit startling. I'm going to put her Twitter tweet on the screen right now, and I'll read it in full. She was responding to Andrew Coyne, who said, "Let the CBC's many passionate, dedicated viewers pay for it," which is a perspective I hold. Now, Christine Stewart, the executive of CBC, said, "Better to give the CBC the British BBC model and the Australian ABC model and multi-year mandate." Now, Minister, I've looked up both the BBC and Australian model. The BBC model is a $250 a year TV tax, plus the ABC model is basically their current funding. Is this a non-starter? What do you make of the TV tax that's proposed implicitly by following the BBC model?
Non-starter. Our government is interested in lowering taxes on Canadians, not increasing. So certainly Ms. Stewart can have her opinion on that subject matter, but it's the government that legislates, and the government's not raising taxes on consumers. And the BBC model is not one that we're going to follow when it comes to funding or taxing consumers. We're not interested in that.
I'm glad to hear. Now, Andrew Coyne, which prompted Christine Stewart's remark, suggested, why don't we if the CBC has so many passionate viewers, why not let them chip in? And I really think they do have a lot of passionate viewers. Would you be open to an American model that they have for PBS and National Public Radio down there, where they have once a month or so a telethon, really, and saying, hey, if you love us so much, prove it? Would you be open to a PBS or NPR model up here too, Minister?
I would be dishonest if I on the funding side or the programming?
On the funding, or on either. What you tell me what you have to say.
Well, I think the programming side wouldn't work for Canada in our dynamic. Don't forget the PBS actually, they have their news hour, but the PBS actually doesn't generate any news. They don't have news bureaus across the country. They obviously operate in one official language, not in the 10 languages that the CBC operates in. So their footprint is very small, their mandate is very small. They don't actually generate news. They're basically a network for commentary and for airing documentaries, and that's not how we approach public broadcasting in Canada. So there's that. But on the funding side, I know I'd be curious to hear what you and others would have to say about that. I mean, look, the CBC already receives a lot of money, but if we were to give them essentially charitable status and have them be a charity but also receive taxpayers' money, allowing them to take money from both sides of the general approach in which people contribute to entities with government resources, I suspect that your bosses wouldn't be a big fan of that.
Oh, I'm not saying both. I'm saying migrate them towards let people. I would be thrilled if the government got out of the funding business, but Canadians said, you know what, we don't want to just give them 1.1 billion. We want to give them 5 billion because we love them so much. I mean, if people really want to donate that much, let them. And I'd say displace the government money from those who are forced to pay and replace it with those who love to pay.
Well, and this in the same vein, Ezra, I've taken great scorn from the Friends of the CBC. Because I've suggested, look, if you're going to go around and appoint yourself as the head or as the head of the Friends of the CBC and raise money off it and make a little mini career out of yourself, I'm always curious about how these folks who are the Friends of the CBC, do they actually do fundraisers for the CBC? Do they raise money for the CBC? Do they donate the proceeds that they get to the CBC? Or are they just making a cottage industry for themselves by piggybacking off of the CBC? Like, what exactly is it that they're giving back to the CBC? So I think that these folks who posture as though they're protectors and defenders of the CBC ought to put their money where their mouth is and show us exactly what they're actually doing for the CBC.
Now, Minister, I've used the word bailout because I see the CBC as the biggest broadcaster in Canada, which they are, and it's a huge corporation, but every year they come back to the government saying, can we please get more money? They're looking for a $1.1 billion bailout. In your perfect future, let's say 10 years from now, if we've had the James Moore policy for 10 years, do you see a time when the government no longer funds the CBC, or do you think it perpetually needs a bailout?
I don't use the word bailout. I mean, I think there is a role for a public broadcaster. It's a sequence of questions the way I see it, Ezra. First is, do you believe in the role that there should be a public broadcaster, yes or no? If the answer is no, then there ends the conversation. If the answer is yes, then the question is, then what exactly should their mandate be? And then third is, how much are we prepared to pay for that, or how much taxpayers' funding is necessary for that? So I think that answer A, yes, I do think there's a role for public broadcaster in Canada. Part two, what should their mandate be? I think they should be a uniquely, purely Canadian broadcaster that broadcasts Canadian news and information to Canadians. And then third, how much are we prepared to pay for that? Well, this is a moving target, as you know. But for us, it's been moving down. When the CBC came to our government and asked us for a bailout when the economy was in its nadir in 2008, 2009, we said no. We ended the CBC's guaranteed funding in the Canada Television Fund. From when I became minister through until today, CBC is 25% smaller in terms of employees. Since I became minister, the CBC has gone from 8 unions to 5 unions. And we have ensured that in the Canada Media Fund, for example, in order to qualify for taxpayer funding for programming, the CBC has to demonstrate that they actually have audience success, that Canadians want to watch what the CBC is showing in order to qualify for that funding. And it's your parent company, Sun TV's owners, that sit on the board of the Canada Media Fund. So we've driven accountability, plus the access to information question, which I know isn't resolved, but we've gone a long way to making the CBC more accountable, smaller, and more in line with what I think Canadians expect. But as you know, with a public broadcaster, this debate is never over, and that's as it should be.
Well, I'm going to dispute you saying that the broadcaster is smaller. I mean, they've never had a larger budget. But I want one last question.
They have had a larger budget. Absolutely, they've had a larger budget.
When did they have a larger budget?
Well, before I became minister, they had a larger budget. They had a guaranteed 30% of the Canada Television Fund. That's now gone.
Right, but they've never received more than the $1.15 billion that they get from you now.
Yes, they have.
When did they get more than $1.15 billion a year from the feds?
Before I became, hit the mic there. Before I became minister, they did. They had a guaranteed funding in the Canada Media Fund or Canada Television Fund envelope, 30% of, and it was up to $30 million that they were expecting them to translate over into the Canada Media Fund, and they don't get that now. Their funding is today smaller than when I became minister.
Last question for you. We saw recently Mary Walsh on the show This Hour is 22 Minutes go to Rob Ford's personal home, which I've never seen the CBC do before, and push the mayor and jostle him. And I saw an edge there that I've never seen when the CBC tackles liberal politicians like Bob Rae or Jean Chrétien. Do you think that the public broadcaster in Canada is nonpartisan and down the middle, or do you think that they tilt to the left?
I think Mary Walsh's behavior was out of line, and I don't think she can be defended with what she did. I think there's a public and a private sphere. And look, Rob Ford, by the way, is a guy, I think, with a great sense of humor, and he's been pretty open about letting people into his life and being pretty experimental with different kinds of photo ops. And I think if the CBC or Mary Walsh had said to Rob Ford, hey, we have this kind of an idea for a photo op, or what if we staged something where Marg kind of ambushed you, and maybe. But I think she violated clearly what was a boundary between a public and private space of a public person, and I don't think what she did can be defended. Not least of which, by the way, is to say that Warrior Princess, this routine, is getting on 20 years old, and I would hope that somebody would show a little bit more imagination than what was on display the other day in the violation of Rob Ford's private family space.
Well, it was a very successful Halloween costume for me last night. James Moore.
Well, you got that. Well, you got a Halloween costume out of it, Ezra. A, and B, on top of it, I think, as is said, every taxpayer contributes about $35 per year to the CBC. I congratulate you on getting the most out of your $35.
James Moore, Minister of Heritage, you're a really good sport for coming on the show, considering how tough I've been on you these past months. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.